The flashlight beam swept across the girl's face, illuminating hollow eyes and cracked lips. She stood barefoot in the tall grass just beyond the tree line, her small frame swaying with exhaustion. Deputy Martin Crowley lowered his maglite slightly, not wanting to blind her. Behind him, the darkness of the Salmon Chalice National Forest pressed in from all sides, broken only by the distant glow of search floodlights half a mile back at the staging area. "Emily?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't respond. She was staring past him towards something he couldn't see. Her bare feet were caked with dried mud and pine needles. Her thin arms hung at her sides, scratched and marked with insect bites that had long since scabbed over. The faded cotton dress she wore hung loosely on her frame, several sizes too large, the hem torn and stained with what looked like berry juice. It was September 14th, 1998. 4 years, 2 months and 11 days since 6-year-old twin sisters Emily and Sarah Holbrook had disappeared from a family camping trip near the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. The case had dominated Idaho news for months before fading into the cold case files, another tragedy absorbed into the vast wilderness. Now, one of them stood before him, 10 years old, alive against every statistical probability. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy deep, real-world investigations. Crowley keyed his handheld radio, his thumb trembling slightly on the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I have visual contact with a juvenile female, approximate age 10, northeast quadrant of search grid Echo 4, requesting immediate medical and supervisor response." The static crackle came back almost instantly. "Copy that, 7. Medical en route. Sheriff Davis is rolling now. ETA 12 minutes. Crowley took a careful step forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "My name is Martin. I'm a deputy sheriff. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's lips moved, forming words without sound, then barely audible. "Emily." The story had started in the summer of 1994, when the Holbrook family drove up from Boise for a weekend camping trip along one of Idaho's most scenic and remote waterways. David Holbrook, a telecommunications engineer who'd worked for Mountain Bell for 15 years, and his wife Jennifer, a third-grade teacher at Hawthorne Elementary, had packed their Ford Explorer with camping gear, fishing rods, and enough food for 3 days in the wilderness. The twins, Emily and Sarah, had just finished kindergarten, earning identical report cards praising their curiosity and creativity. Witnesses at the Boundary Creek campground remembered seeing the girls playing near the water's edge on the afternoon of July 3rd, building small rock towers, while their parents set up their tent site at campsite number 14. The campground host, retired logger Bill Mackenzie, later told investigators he'd noticed the family arrive around noon, had helped David back the Explorer into the site, and had seen the girls laughing and chasing each other near the creek around 5:30 p.m. By 6:47 p.m. that evening, both girls were gone. Jennifer Holbrook had called them for dinner. When they didn't respond, she walked down to the creek. Their rock towers stood undisturbed, still balanced precariously where they'd left them. Their matching pink sneakers sat side by side on a flat stone, as if they'd taken them off to wade in the shallow water. But there was no sign of Emily or Sarah. David ran to the campground host's trailer. Mackenzie immediately began organizing nearby campers to search the immediate area, while David drove to the nearest ranger station, 15 miles south, to report the disappearance. By 8:15 p.m., Valley County Sheriff's Office had been notified. By 9:00 p.m., the first deputies were on scene. The initial search had mobilized quickly. Valley County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the U.S. Forest Service, deploying 60 personnel across a 3-mile radius by daybreak on July 4th. Bloodhounds from the Idaho State Police Canine Unit picked up traces near the creek, but lost the scent at a rocky outcropping 200 yards upstream, where the ground transitioned from soft soil to bare granite. Helicopter sweeps using Vietnam-era infrared cameras found nothing but deer and elk in the dense timber. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense lodgepole pine forests interspersed with Douglas fir, steep ravines dropping hundreds of feet to rushing streams, and cold mountain water that could induce hypothermia within an hour, even in July. Search teams worked in rotating shifts for 14 days straight. They covered over 40 square miles, checking every abandoned cabin, every mine shaft, every hidden drawer and boulder field. Divers searched the deeper pools of the Salmon River. Rock climbers rappelled down cliff faces to check ledges and crevices. Volunteer searchers from across Idaho arrived by the hundreds, forming human chains to sweep through the densest brush. By day 5, the official search scaled back to limited ground crews and aerial reconnaissance. By day 14, it was declared a recovery operation, though no one wanted to say those words to David and Jennifer Holbrook. By autumn, when the first snow fell across the high country, blanketing the search area in white silence, the case was filed as a presumed double fatality, cause unknown, suspected accidental drowning despite the absence of bodies. David and Jennifer Holbrook never accepted that conclusion. They returned to the forest every summer for the next 4 years, posting flyers on every bulletin board from Chalice to Stanley, walking the same trails until they could navigate them in their sleep, interviewing hikers and campers and asking the same questions over and over. Jennifer kept a detailed logbook of every trip, every conversation, every fragment of hope or suspicious detail. The notebook's pages grew thick with ink and desperation. David carried a Polaroid camera everywhere, photographing every clearing, every cabin, every dirt road intersection within 20 miles of the original campsite, building a visual archive that filled 3 shoeboxes. Now, in September 1998, Deputy Martin Crowley was staring at what looked like a ghost made flesh. Sheriff Raymond Davis arrived at the scene within 12 minutes. His cruiser's headlights cutting through the darkness as he pulled off Forest Road 579 onto the narrow access trail. Behind him came the Valley County Ambulance, its red strobes painting the trees in rhythmic pulses that made the forest seem to pulse with strange life. Davis was 53, a career law enforcement officer who'd worked the original disappearance and still kept the case file in his desk drawer, unable to let it go completely. He stepped out of his vehicle, carrying a thermal blanket and a plastic canteen filled with water. His boots crunched on the dry pine needles as he approached. Emily, if it was truly Emily, hadn't moved. She stood in the same spot, her gaze fixed on the tree line to the east, as if watching for something only she could see. Crowley had kept his distance, following protocol for dealing with traumatized children, maintaining a position between the girl and the forest, while ensuring she had a clear escape route if she needed it. When Davis approached, he moved slowly, years of experience teaching him how to read body language. He crouched down to her eye level about 10 feet away, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Hi there," he said softly. "My name is Ray. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Her skin was pale under the dirt, her arms marked with scratches in various stages of healing, some fresh and angry, others faded to white scars. Her hair, which should have been blonde according to the case file photographs pinned to his office wall, was darker now, perhaps from dirt and sun exposure, tangled with pine needles and small twigs. The EMTs arrived with a gurney and medical kit. Lead paramedic Sandra Voss, a 20-year veteran who'd worked the original search back in 1994, felt her throat tighten when she saw the girl. She conducted a preliminary assessment from a respectful distance, elevated heart rate at approximately 110 beats per minute, signs of dehydration evident in the dry lips and sunken eyes, possible malnutrition based on visible bone structure, but ambulatory and conscious. No visible signs of acute trauma or bleeding. Pupils reactive to light, breathing steady but shallow. They wrapped her in the thermal blanket and offered water, which she drank in small, careful sips. When they guided her toward the ambulance, she moved stiffly, as if her joints ached. It was only as they helped her onto the gurney, Voss's hand gentle on her elbow, that Emily spoke clearly for the first time. "Sarah's still there," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "I heard her calling." Davis exchanged a glance with Crowley. Every instinct honed over 3 decades told him this was the critical moment. "Where?" he asked gently, keeping his tone neutral, non-leading. "Where is Sarah?" Emily pointed east with one thin arm, deeper into the forest where the darkness seemed absolute. "Past the big tree. She was calling my name. I tried to find help. I ran toward the voice." Davis felt something cold settle in his chest. "What voice, Emily?" "The one calling us, from the radio, but far away." By midnight, a full-scale search operation was underway. The Valley County Sheriff's Office activated mutual aid agreements with surrounding jurisdictions, pulling resources from Custer County, Boise County, and Lemhi County. Idaho State Police sent additional personnel and their mobile command unit. The Forest Service reopened the old command post at Boundary Creek, a weathered wooden building that had served as the nerve center for the 1994 search, dragging out the same topographic maps and grid overlays they'd used 4 years ago, the paper now yellowed and creased from repeated folding. Davis stood at the operations table at 200 hours, studying the terrain under harsh fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered. Grid Echo 4, where Crowley had found Emily, was approximately 4 miles northeast of the original disappearance site. Rugged country, thick with deadfall and seasonal streams that ran dry by late summer. The big tree, Emily mentioned, could be anything in a forest filled with old-growth timber, but searchers familiar with the area suggested it might refer to an old-growth ponderosa pine that stood near a rocky saddle about half a mile deeper into the forest, a landmark known to hunters and backpackers. Coffee brewed in a battered percolator. Sandwiches arrived from a gas station in Stanley, delivered by a volunteer who'd heard about the search on the radio. Davis briefed the assembled search coordinators, spreading the map flat on the table and marking Emily's recovery location with a red pin. "We're treating this as a live recovery operation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Sarah Holbrook may be injured, disoriented, or unable to move. Weather forecast shows temperatures dropping to the low 40s tonight. Time is critical." The search teams assembled at 600 hours as grey dawn light began filtering through the trees. 36 personnel divided into 9 4-person teams, each assigned a specific grid sector marked on laminated map sections. They carried VHF radios on channel frequencies coordinated through dispatch, first aid supplies, including trauma kits and thermal blankets, topographic maps marked with elevation contours and water sources, silver compasses for navigation, binoculars, whistles for signaling, and enough food and water for 8 hours in the field. Canine units from Boise were en route, but wouldn't arrive until mid-morning due to the distance. The helicopter, a Bell 206 contracted through the State Division of Aeronautics, was grounded until the morning fog lifted from the valleys. Team 3, led by Deputy Angela Reeves, a former Army medic with wilderness rescue training, took the sector Emily had pointed toward. They moved in a line formation, maintaining visual contact, calling out Sarah's name every 30 seconds as they advanced through the timber. The forest was quiet, except for the crunch of boots on dry pine needles and the occasional call of a Clark's nutcracker overhead, its harsh cry echoing through the morning stillness. At 8:47 hours, they found the tree. It was massive, A ponderosa pine at least 200 years old, its trunk nearly 6 feet in diameter, its bark the color of burnt orange and deeply furrowed. The lower branches started 20 feet up, spreading wide over the forest floor. Carved into the bark, about 4 feet off the ground where a child could reach, was a symbol. 2 vertical lines connected by a horizontal bar, like a crude letter H. Below it, someone had scratched EM plus SR, followed by 94. Reeves keyed her radio. "Command, Team 3. We've located what appears to be the landmark described by the witness, large ponderosa pine with carved markings. Stand by for further." They spread out in a circular search pattern, radiating from the tree in careful sweeps, checking behind every boulder, under every fallen log, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. 50 yards to the northeast, Deputy Tom Wexler found a piece of fabric snagged on a low branch, faded red cotton, weathered by years of exposure to sun and rain, the threads weak and brittle. 30 yards beyond that, they discovered a shallow depression in the ground, partially obscured by fallen branches that looked deliberately arranged rather than naturally deposited. Clearing away the branches revealed a makeshift shelter. Fallen logs arranged in a lean-to configuration, covered with pine boughs and strips of bark carefully layered to shed water. Inside was a child's blue jacket, torn and stained with mud and what might have been blood, long since dried to brown. Next to it sat a rusted tin can that had once held peaches, the metal corroded by moisture and time. The label was still partially legible through the rust. "Dole-sliced peaches, 1993. But no Sarah. Reeves photographed everything with her department-issued Nikon before touching anything, establishing the scene for later forensic processing. Then she keyed her radio again. "Command, we have a possible shelter site, evidence of habitation, no sign of the second subject, requesting forensic team and expanded search radius." Emily was transferred to St. Luke's Medical Center in Boise, riding in the ambulance with Sandra Voss, monitoring her vital signs throughout the 90-minute journey down winding mountain roads. Dr. Patricia Greenfield, a pediatric specialist with extensive experience in trauma cases, was waiting when they arrived just after dawn. She conducted the initial examination in a quiet room painted soft blue, designed to be non-threatening to children. Emily was severely dehydrated, her blood pressure low, her electrolytes dangerously imbalanced. She weighed 32 pounds when she should have been closer to 60 for her age. Her feet showed extensive callousing and old scarring, the kind you'd see on someone who'd walked barefoot for years. Several toenails were missing, likely torn off on rough terrain. Her teeth needed immediate dental work, cavities, early signs of gum disease, a small chip on one incisor. But physically, structurally, she was stable. Her organs were functioning, her bones were intact. Psychologically, it was far more complicated. Emily spoke in fragmented sentences, often trailing off mid-thought as if losing the thread of her own narrative. She couldn't recall specific dates or sequences of events. When asked about the past 4 years, she described sleeping in the place and eating what we found. She mentioned berries, huckleberries that grew in the clearings in late summer, tiny wild strawberries hidden under leaves. She talked about roots she and Sarah had learned to dig, pine nuts they'd gathered in autumn, and the cans the man left. "What man?" Dr. Greenfield asked gently, keeping her voice level, clinical. Emily's eyes went distant, focusing on something beyond the hospital room walls. "He came sometimes. He brought food in boxes. He said we had to stay quiet. He said the forest would hurt us if we left. He said our mom and dad didn't want us anymore." Sheriff Davis, observing the interview through a one-way mirror in the adjacent observation room, felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. This was no longer a lost child case, no longer an accident or tragic misadventure. This was something else entirely, something that made his decades of law enforcement experience feel inadequate. The FBI field office in Boise was notified immediately. Special Agent Claire Holston arrived at the hospital by noon, carrying a leather briefcase and a case file that had been dormant for 4 years, stored in a basement archive with thousands of other unsolved cases. She was 38, methodical, and known throughout the Bureau for working child abduction cases with surgical precision and an unwillingness to accept convenient explanations. After reviewing Dr. Greenfield's preliminary notes and the initial interview transcript, Holston requested a careful, structured interview following FBI protocols for child witnesses. Emily was given apple juice and crackers, and they let her rest for an hour in a quiet room before beginning. The conversation was recorded on a Sony cassette tape recorder, standard procedure for testimony preservation and later analysis. A female FBI victim specialist was present to monitor Emily's emotional state. "Emily," Holston said, her voice calm and even, with no inflection that might suggest desired answers, "I need you to help me understand what happened. Can you tell me about the last thing you remember before you and Sarah disappeared, before you went to the place with the man?" Emily's small hands gripped the edge of the hospital blanket, her knuckles white. "We were playing by the water, the creek. Sarah found a frog, a little green one. She wanted to keep it, but I said we had to let it go. Then we saw the man at the trees. He was standing there watching us. He said our dad sent him to get us. He said we had to come with him right away." "Did your dad send him?" "No." Emily's voice was barely audible. "He lied. Dad wouldn't send someone we didn't know, but we were scared. He seemed angry, so we went with him." "Can you describe what he looked like?" Emily closed her eyes, and for a long moment Holston thought she wouldn't answer. Then, tall, brown hair. He had a truck, dark blue. It smelled like cigarettes inside. He made us sit on the floor in the back so nobody could see us. The investigation shifted rapidly from search and rescue to criminal investigation. This was now a federal kidnapping case under the Lindbergh law, with potential homicide implications if Sarah Holbrook couldn't be located alive. The FBI deployed additional agents from the Salt Lake City field office and coordinated with the Idaho State Police Forensics Unit. The shelter found near the Ponderosa Pine was processed as a potential crime scene. Forensic technician Marcus Delano, a meticulous analyst with 15 years of experience, photographed every angle with his 35mm Nikon, documenting the structure from multiple perspectives. The fabric scraps still clinging to branches, the rusted tin can sitting in the dirt. He took close-up shots of the carved markings on the tree, using a ruler for scale reference. Soil samples were collected in sterile containers, labeled with location coordinates and depth measurements. The carved symbol on the tree was photographed with side lighting to enhance the three-dimensional relief of the cuts into the bark. The tin can's batch code, still faintly visible on the bottom, was documented for later tracking through manufacturer records. Fingerprint analysis was conducted using traditional powder and tape lifts, a painstaking process requiring careful application of black magnetic powder to the tin can's curved surface. They recovered 17 partial prints from various surfaces, most too degraded by weather exposure for comparison, the ridge patterns eroded by 4 years of temperature cycling and moisture, but 3 prints were intact enough to process through standard comparison protocols. These were photographed, lifted onto clear tape, mounted on fingerprint cards, and sent to the FBI's fingerprint laboratory in Washington, D.C., via overnight Federal Express courier. Meanwhile, back at St. Luke's, Emily provided more details during subsequent interviews conducted over several days. She described being taken in the truck. Dark blue, maybe black, I'm not sure. and driven for what felt like hours over rough roads that made her and Sarah bounce on the floor. She remembered arriving at a cabin as darkness fell. The man carried them inside, one under each arm. He put them on cots and gave them crackers and water. The cabin became their world. Small, maybe 15 feet square, with a wood stove that the man would light on cold nights. 2 narrow cots with thin mattresses, shelves with canned food, a bucket for a toilet. 1 window, but it was high up and covered with boards. The man came every few days at first, bringing food, canned goods from a grocery store, bread that sometimes had mold on it, beef jerky that was too tough for their small teeth, occasionally candy bars that tasted stale. He told them they couldn't leave. He said the forest was full of bears and mountain lions. He said they'd die of cold if they tried to run. He said their parents had moved away and didn't want them anymore, that he was keeping them safe, that they should be grateful. "Did he hurt you?" Holston asked carefully, prepared for any answer. Emily shook her head. "He didn't hit us. He just made us stay. He watched us sometimes, but mostly he just brought food and left. Sometimes he'd be gone for a long time. We counted the days by the sun." Over time, the man's visits became less frequent. Sometimes a week passed, then 2 weeks, then longer. Emily and Sarah learned to forage when the food ran low. They found huckleberry bushes growing in a clearing near the cabin. They learned which roots were safe to eat by trial and error. They drank from a nearby creek, the same water that eventually gave them both giardia, an intestinal parasite that caused weeks of sickness. When the cabin's door latch broke during a heavy windstorm last spring, the old wood simply splintering under pressure, they realized for the first time that they could leave. But by then, they'd been isolated so long they weren't sure which direction to go. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. They were afraid of getting lost, of the bears the man had warned them about, of the cold that came at night, even in summer. "Why did you finally leave?" Holston asked. "Because Sarah was getting sick," Emily said, her voice dropping to almost nothing. "Really sick, not just stomach sick. She had fever, she couldn't eat. I thought she might die. We tried to find the road to find help, but we got lost. We walked for days, we had no food. Then I heard the voice." "What voice?" "A man's voice, calling our names, both our names. It came from the trees at night when it was dark. I ran toward it, but Sarah couldn't keep up. Her ankle was hurt from falling. She told me to go get help, and she'd wait by the rocks, but I couldn't find my way back." Holston leaned forward slightly. "What did the voice say exactly?" Emily's brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't remember the words, just voices, talking, like from far away, like the radio the man had in the cabin, but outside in the forest." "What did the voice sound like?" Emily looked confused. Like a voice on a radio, not close, far away, fuzzy, but I thought if there were people, they could help Sarah. So I ran." The search for Sarah intensified into what became one of the largest wilderness search operations in Idaho history. Teams scoured a 5-mile radius around the Ponderosa Pine, expanding outward in careful grid patterns marked on laminated maps, updated every 6 hours. The FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment to check for disturbed Earth, though nobody wanted to say why out loud. Bloodhounds tracked Emily's scent backward from the location where Deputy Crowley had found her, their noses low to the ground, leading searchers along a winding game trail that crossed 2 seasonal streams, now mostly dry, and wound through heavy timber where the canopy blocked out most of the light. Additional resources arrived from across the region. Mountain rescue teams from Sun Valley brought technical climbing gear for checking cliff faces. The Idaho National Guard deployed a Huey helicopter with thermal imaging equipment. Volunteers from search and rescue organizations in 4 states converged on the command post, signing in on clipboards and receiving grid assignments. 3 days into the renewed search, working from dawn until darkness made continuing dangerous, Team 7 discovered the cabin. It sat in a small clearing about 6 miles north of the original campsite, barely visible through the trees, even when you knew it was there. The structure was old, probably built in the 1960s by hunters or prospectors during a brief uranium exploration boom, with weathered plank siding that had turned silvery grey with age and a rusted tin roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The door hung open on bent hinges, creaking in the slight breeze that moved through the pines. Deputy Reeves approached cautiously, her hand on her service weapon, though she wasn't sure what threat might remain after 4 years. "Valley County Sheriff's Office. Anyone inside?" Silence. Just wind moving through the trees and the distant call of a raven. The interior was dim and musty, smelling of rot and animal droppings. 2 narrow cots lined one wall, their thin mattresses stained dark with mildew and torn in places where mice had nested. A wood stove sat cold in the corner, its chimney pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. Shelves held the remnants of supplies. Dozens of empty tin cans, torn cardboard packages that had once held crackers or cookies, a box of wooden matches with only 3 left. On a small wooden table sat a battery-powered radio, its antenna extended, its dial set to 162. 550 millihertz, the frequency used by no AA weather radio for continuous automated weather broadcasts. But there was no sign of Sarah. Forensic processing began immediately, with Delano establishing a perimeter and documenting everything before any evidence was disturbed. He photographed every surface with methodical precision, collecting fingerprints from the table, the radio casing, the tin cans, the doorframe. On the underside of one of the cots, scratched into the wood frame with something sharp, maybe a nail, were more markings, EM plus SR, and a series of vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, the kind of tally marks you'd make to count days when you had no calendar. Delano counted them twice to be sure. There were 217 marks. Outside, searchers found a crude trash pit about 50 yards from the cabin, a shallow depression filled with refuse. Buried under a thin layer of soil and decomposing pine needles were more tin cans, dozens of them, their labels rotted away. Torn clothing that had once been colourful but was now faded to shades of grey and brown. And a child's sneaker, size 12, pink with white trim, the rubber sole separating from the canvas upper, matching the description of what Sarah Holbrook had been wearing when she disappeared 4 years ago. But still no Sarah. The fingerprint results came back on day 6 of the renewed search. The FBI laboratory in Washington had processed the prints on an expedited schedule, running them through the automated fingerprint identification system that maintained records of anyone ever arrested or employed in sensitive positions. 3 viable prints from the tin can at the Ponderosa Pine Shelter matched a man named Leonard Pike, age 47, with a criminal history that made everyone working the case feel physically ill. Pike had been convicted in 1988 for unlawful imprisonment in Oregon, a case involving a 13-year-old girl he'd kept in a storage shed for 6 days before she escaped. He'd served only 3 years before parole, released with mandatory counseling and registration requirements that he'd apparently ignored. He'd worked various jobs in Idaho since 1992, seasonal logging with a timber company near McCall, ranch work in the Lemhi Valley, construction labor on highway projects. His last known address was a trailer park in Chalice, about 40 miles from Boundary Creek Campground. When FBI agents and local deputies arrived at Pike's trailer on September 21, 1998, they found it abandoned. The door was unlocked, the interior stripped of personal belongings. Neighbors in adjacent trailers said he'd left in late August, maybe early September, saying something about work in Montana or maybe Wyoming. His truck, a 1987 Dodge Ram, dark blue with primer spots on the hood, was gone. An all-points bulletin went out across the western states within hours. Pike's photograph, pulled from his 1992 Idaho driver's license, was distributed to every law enforcement agency from Washington to Colorado. He was described as white, 6 feet tall, approximately 190 pounds, brown hair graying at the temples, last seen wearing work boots and denim, armed and dangerous, federal warrant issued for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and child endangerment. Meanwhile, the search for Sarah continued with renewed urgency. Emily was brought back to the cabin site, carefully with Dr. Greenfield and Agent Holston present, ensuring she was emotionally prepared to see if it triggered any specific memories that might help locate her sister. She stood at the clearing's edge, staring at the weathered structure. "This is where we were," she said quietly, her voice flat. "For a long time." "Can you show us where you last saw Sarah?" Holston asked. Emily walked slowly down the game trail that led away from the cabin, the same path searchers had been following. About 300 yards east, she stopped at a cluster of large granite boulders, some as big as cars, arranged in a natural jumble that created small caves and overhangs. "Here," she said. "We sat here when we heard the voice. Sarah's ankle was hurt bad. She couldn't walk fast. I said I'd run ahead and find help, and she said she'd wait. But when I came back with the deputy, I couldn't find this place again in the dark. Everything looked the same." Search teams saturated the area around the boulders, working methodically, checking under every rock overhang, behind every fallen log, peering into every shadowed crevice, calling Sarah's name continuously until their voices echoed off the granite faces. The weather was turning, cold fronts moving in from the north, bringing heavy clouds and occasional rain showers that dropped temperatures into the 40s at night. Time was running out. On day 8, September 22, 1998, a canine unit made a hit. The dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, trained specifically for wilderness search and rescue, alerted on a thick patch of scrub oak about 100 yards downslope from the granite boulders. Deputy Wexler pushed through the brush, thorns tearing at his uniform, and found a small opening, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, leading to a natural rock shelter formed by a massive granite overhang that created a protected space about 8 feet deep. Inside, curled in a fetal position on a bed of dry pine needles and moss, was Sarah Holbrook. She was unconscious, but alive, breathing shallow but steady. The medical evacuation was swift and professional. Paramedics stabilized Sarah on site, checking vital signs, starting an IV line for fluids and electrolytes, immobilizing her clearly broken ankle with an inflatable splint. By 14:30 hours, she was loaded onto a stretcher and carried to the staging area, where a Bell 206 medical helicopter was waiting, its rotors already spinning. By 14:45, she was airborne, the helicopter banking south toward Boise, while paramedics monitored her throughout the 35-minute flight. Dr. Greenfield was already at St. Luke's Medical Center, having rushed back from the search site when word came through that Sarah had been found. When the helicopter touched down on the rooftop helipad, she was there with a trauma team. Sarah's condition was critical but stable, severe dehydration, her body weight dangerously low at 29 pounds, core temperature at 94, 3 degrees, mild hypothermia. A compound fracture to her left ankle that had become severely infected, the surrounding tissue angry and swollen, suggesting the break had occurred days ago. She'd survived 8 days alone in the forest, with no food except what she could reach from her position, no clean water except what rain collected in natural depressions in the stone, and a fever that had likely kept her barely conscious for much of that time. When she finally regained consciousness 36 hours later in the pediatric intensive care unit, surrounded by monitors and IV lines, her first word was, "Emily." Jennifer Holbrook, who hadn't left the hospital since Emily was first brought in, was sitting beside Sarah's bed when her eyes opened. She gripped her daughter's hand and wept. Over the following weeks, both girls slowly recovered. Physical therapy for Sarah's ankle, which required surgery to properly set the bones and clean the infection. Nutritional rehabilitation for both, carefully managed to avoid refeeding syndrome. Psychological counseling to address the trauma, conducted by specialists who understood developmental psychology and the long-term effects of prolonged isolation and captivity. Jennifer and David Holbrook barely left their daughter's sides. They slept in hospital chairs, ate cafeteria food, and answered endless questions from law enforcement while trying to process their own complex mix of relief, rage, and guilt. The FBI interrogation of Leonard Pike, when he was finally apprehended at a truck stop gas station outside Missoula, Montana, on October 8, 1998, revealed the full scope of what had happened. Pike had been living out of his truck, working occasional cash jobs at construction sites, staying one step ahead of the law. A Montana state trooper recognized him from the APB during a routine stop for a broken taillight. In the interview room at the Missoula County Jail, Pike confessed to abducting the girls in 1994. The interrogation, recorded on video and audio tape, showed a man who seemed almost relieved to finally talk. He described it as an impulse, seeing the girls alone by the creek, their parents distracted setting up camp. He'd convinced himself in that moment that he was rescuing them from something, though he couldn't articulate what. He kept them in the old cabin, bringing supplies periodically, rationalizing to himself that he was keeping them safe from a world he saw as cruel and dangerous. But as months turned into years, Pike's guilt and paranoia grew. He became irregular with his visits, sometimes going weeks without returning, paralyzed by fear of being caught and uncertainty about how to resolve the situation he'd created. When the cabin's door broke and the girls realized they could leave, Pike had already begun distancing himself, knowing the situation was unsustainable but unable to take responsibility. "Why didn't you just let them go?" Agent Holston asked during the recorded interview, her voice neutral, but her eyes hard. 4 years. You had 4 years to do the right thing. Pike stared at his handcuffed wrists resting on the metal table. I thought about it. Every single time I went there, I thought about it. But I was scared of what would happen to me. Prison. So I kept putting it off. I kept telling myself I'd figure something out, that maybe they'd forget or... I don't know, I didn't think, I just kept going. Did you know they'd left the cabin? No, I hadn't been there in over a month. I was trying to distance myself, to pretend it wasn't happening. The mystery of the voice, the sound that had drawn Emily through the darkness and ultimately saved both girls' lives, remained until forensic analysis and atmospheric research provided the explanation. The battery-powered radio found in the cabin, tuned to the NOAA weather radio frequency of 162, 550 MHz, had been transmitting automated weather broadcasts throughout the girls' captivity. Emily and Sarah had grown accustomed to hearing it as background noise, the mechanical voice announcing temperature, humidity, wind speed, and weather warnings in an endless automated loop. However, investigation revealed that during certain atmospheric conditions, particularly temperature inversions common in mountain valleys during clear nights when warm air settles over cooler air near the ground, VHF radio signals could undergo a phenomenon called tropospheric ducting. This caused radio transmissions to bounce off atmospheric layers and propagate far beyond their normal range, sometimes for hundreds of miles. On the night of September 14, 1998, when Emily heard the voice calling, meteorological records showed a significant temperature inversion over the Salmon River Valley. Deputy Crowley's initial call on his VHF handheld radio at 162. 450 MHz, a frequency very close to the no-A weather frequency Emily was familiar with, announcing his arrival at the search staging area several miles away, had been affected by this ducting phenomenon. The signal bounced off the inversion layer and propagated clearly through the forest in a way that wouldn't normally occur. Emily, conditioned by 4 years of hearing automated radio voices as a constant presence in the cabin, had associated any radio-like voice with the possibility of rescue, of connection to the outside world. When she heard Crowley's transmission, distorted and distant but clearly human rather than automated, she ran toward it, not knowing the signal was bouncing off atmospheric layers and didn't represent his actual physical position. By pure chance, by a convergence of physics and probability that couldn't be replicated, her frantic run through the forest brought her close enough to the actual search grid that Crowley spotted her with his flashlight when he swept his patrol area one last time before returning to base. It wasn't divine intervention or supernatural guidance. It was atmospheric physics, electromagnetic propagation theory, and the kind of astronomical coincidence that makes people question whether chance alone governs the universe. The case file was officially closed in March 1999. Leonard Pike was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and child endangerment, with additional state charges pending. The Holbrook family moved to a new home in Nampa, seeking privacy and a fresh start away from the media attention that had consumed their lives. Emily and Sarah, now 11 years old, slowly rebuilt their childhood under the care of specialized therapists who understood developmental trauma and attachment disorders. The recovery was not easy or linear. There were nightmares, regression, moments of fear when a door closed or darkness fell. But there was also resilience, the bond between sisters that had kept them alive and parents who refused to give up. The carved symbols on the ponderosa pine remained as evidence, photographed and documented, but left undisturbed. The cabin was eventually dismantled by the Forest Service, removed as a liability. Years later, hikers would occasionally find the clearing and wonder about the flat space where something once stood. Most never learned the truth. Some things are better left as quiet spaces in the forest, known only to those who lived them. What would you have done differently if you'd been searching that forest, knowing 2 children might still be alive after 4 years? What assumptions would you have questioned? What hope would you have held on to when everyone else said it was time to move on? What would it take for you to believe the impossible? The reality of investigations like this one is that they demand more than evidence and procedure. They require the stubborn refusal to accept the obvious answer when something deeper remains unresolved. Deputy Crowley's decision to continue his patrol that night, despite the search being officially scaled back, saved Emily's life. Her courage to run toward an uncertain voice, even after years of captivity and isolation, created the chance for both sisters to survive. And Sarah's determination to hold on for 8 days, alone in a cold forest, waiting for help she had no reason to believe would come, represented a strength most of us will never be tested enough to measure. Not every case ends with both children coming home. Not every mystery resolves with answers that make sense, but this one did, through persistence, forensic discipline, atmospheric physics, and the kind of luck that only comes to those who refuse to stop looking. If you appreciate real investigations like this one, subscribe and stay curious. The truth is often stranger than fiction, and it's always worth pursuing.